When I say successful coach, who comes to mind for you and why?
Look, it's probably it's multifactorial in terms of who comes to mind. I've been really fortunate to work with some unbelievably experienced coaches, and I think part of my journey has been trying to take a little bit from all of them. I was really fortunate to see Bomber Thompson when I first started at Geelong and see, his ability to be able to, connect with his players, motivate his players, and he had a brilliant ability to be able to simplify the game and teach the game. And Brendan McCartney was there at the same time, probably somewhat in a similar mould. Really fortunate to work with him. He was, very much a mentor to me in terms of my starting in AFL football. So, Macca had a great ability to be able to be as hard as he needed to be on you, but almost then pick you up and cuddle you at the same time, and had a great affinity with the players. The players were always, I felt like his players were always striving to gain his approval or want his, tick off in terms of what they were able to achieve. So, they were two really influential ones early on. I was also lucky to work with Dave Whedon. And Dave's been a stalwart of coaching in the AFL circles for a long period of time, and Dave was really good for me to be able to encourage me to be able to explore what my coaching style was, what I was capable of, and kind of not really follow any mold, just do it the way that suited me the best. So I think probably those guys, early days, certainly had a significant impact on me. And then when I moved across to Carlton, I had the fortune of being able to work with Neil Craig. Again, Neil's got a enormous coaching background. Started with Olympic cycling, working with Charlie Walsh, and then stepped into coaching, high performance, and then coaching in AFL. Coached for AFL at the Adelaide Crows for 8 years, and has since gone on and worked with the English rugby union team and was part of their campaign to a silver medal in the World Cup in rugby. So. And Craigie was an enormous support. He was fantastic for bouncing ideas off, talking to we had great philosophical chats on coaching and what coaching was and maybe ways to look at things. And he had a similar view probably to me to high performance. So that really helped with that. So, when there's a lot of other guys that I've come in contact with that have certainly shaped the way I am, but there are a few that have certainly had a significant impact and shaped, I guess, the way I go about coaching.
If you were to sort of discuss some of your key principles for better and more consistent footy, what would they be?
I think in a coaching sense, the thing that's changed the most for me is I've gone less. I'm less about tactics and content now, and more about people. I think understanding people is the key element of what we do. I think I always think you need both. But for me, there's been a shift. I probably was far more technical, tactical in the early days of my coaching, and I've shifted far more to people and understanding the importance of building those relationships and understanding your people so you can get the best out of them. That doesn't mean that the technical stuff's not important, but it's really difficult. I think you need to be able to tailor your message to your individuals and understand what allows them to be at their best, and for me that's probably the most critical thing.
So if you were giving some couple of key points to coaches out there to help them build those relationships with their players and their people, what would be sort of some action things you could recommend that they could do this upcoming season?
Yeah, look, I think the understanding people is far broader than footy or sport or work or whatever environment you work in. I think it's the ability to be able to understand people and dive a little bit deeper than that and have a deeper relationship that gives you a chance to be able to understand them. So asking questions about their life and what they do, what interests them, what motivates them, the things they enjoyed growing up, what their child, just simple things to try and understand them as people more broadly than them as the employee or them as the athlete. I think is really critical. And I think when you start to do that, you extend their understanding of your relationship goes beyond you being a coach or you being a boss or you being a mentor. Then you start to become someone who's more invested in them than that. It's not about what they can do as the employee or as the footballer. They understand that you're invested in them growing as people, and I think that's really important. So I think any questions that are targeted towards you having a greater understanding of who they are, but the difficult thing often with local sport in particular is there's no quick way to go about doing that. But that might be taking time to sit with their girlfriend at a social function and get a bit of an understanding of her or invest in her, and then sort of get do those little things like that. I think we all get safe in our little groups that we occupy ourselves in, and you kind of got to extend yourself beyond that, particularly to be able to build those relationships. So there are some difficulties, but that's for me, that's what it looks like.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was actually listening to a podcast this week that Kobe Bryant did, and he was talking about Phil Jackson, obviously the legendary basketball coach, and Phil knew the ins and outs of all these players, their backgrounds, their brothers, sisters, their family, their kids' names, where they went to school, obviously. And he's talked about exactly what you've just mentioned about building that relationship, and he knew them a lot more than just on the sporting level, which is fascinating.
I think for your athletes, it gives them, like I said, that sense that you are invested in them as people, and I certainly felt it at local level. When I was coaching at South Barwon, I think initially it was all about the footy when I first started, and that was my driving force. As I coached for a little bit longer, I took great joy in seeing guys hold down full-time jobs and build relationships and have girlfriends and then start families and all those sort of things that started to happen. And that was where my satisfaction came from. I was trying to help them grow as people, and the Phil Jackson ones, it's 100% accurate. We all know as people, like if you are talking to your boss and he automatically knows your girlfriend's name, your mum and dad's name, and the name of all your kids, you will feel more connected. You'll feel like that person is invested in you. It's not just about knowing people's names, but that's kind of an example of what it is. And we all feel it. It's that human connection that we're all looking for. And it's trying to take it from a superficial level to a far deeper level as much as is possible with your group.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the common mistakes that maybe you might have made, particularly in the early days, or you see common mistakes that your coaches do, particularly at a community or a local sort of level?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I reflect on this pretty heavily. I'm lucky enough to be able to present, or not this year, but I've been able to present to coaches in the past, and it's probably the path I go down is trying to reflect on what I've learned and then maybe back to, if I was back in that position again, how would I do it a little bit differently? And there was a lot of stuff we did really well, but I think I didn't necessarily teach the game as well as I could have. In terms of players who were lesser skilled, I assumed a lot. I made an assumption that they knew things, and often they were things that I knew. So that's one thing I would do. I'd be prepared to be quite simplistic and step through it quite basically for players, even things like, how to play certain positions more accurately. I'd put guys on the wing and just assume that they knew how to play on the wing. So they're kind of examples. I think I didn't do a good job of that. And part of it was probably my knowledge certainly wasn't as great as what it is now. It was also part of it. I just made the assumption that they knew, and that was probably wrong on my behalf. I was fortunate enough to coach my sons when he first started. I was co-coaching his under 10 team, and it was a great leveler for me because it took me back and it forced me to step back quite a way, because as soon as you start assuming with under 10s, you get yourself in all sorts of trouble, because, even in terms of what positions are on the ground or what they can do on a kick in and things like that, those kids don't necessarily know that. Some might, but some might not. So, that's certainly one of the things that I think I would do differently. The other thing is I would have a significant reason. I would think through everything, in particular with training. I would think about why I was doing it, what I was doing, and why I was doing it. I think some of the common mistakes are we will revert back to what we've done in the past, and that's quite understandable. Quite common for guys in terms of the drills they do, or I make the joke every time I present to local coaches that if you turn up at most local footy grounds on a Tuesday or Thursday night, the first thing you would see is guys running 2 laps of the oval to warm up. And I don't, we do it because we've always done it.
Yeah.
You'd see lane work, that doesn't mean they're wrong. But if you can understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, the purpose with it, particularly when you're limited with your time, I think that's the thing I would shift more now. I was probably more traditional in what I did based on what I'd known, and I didn't necessarily challenge. And again, with part of it, I didn't have the knowledge of how to be able to do that. I was fortunate when, at Geelong, the transition happened and Mark Thompson left and Chris Scott came in. We went through the process of throwing out every drill we'd ever done before and starting again. And it was a brilliant process to go through. It kind of forced me to understand why, what am I doing here and why am I doing it? And once you have that deeper level, that deeper understanding of what you're doing and why, I think it puts a value on time and the purpose with which you do your training. So they're probably the 2 most significant things that I'd shift if I went back.
It's just interesting when Chris Scott came in, and I guess it was the end of 2010. What was the reasoning behind getting rid of all the training drills? Was it just a complete fresh start? Was that Chris sort of stamping his authority, if you like? Or what was the sort of background behind that? Was it just like you explained in terms of knowing exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it?
Yeah, I think so. I think that he didn't explicitly explain why he made that decision, but my thinking is that he was forcing us to have a deeper understanding of what we're doing and why, not just that we're doing these drills. Being at Carlton, we get access to some great coaches, and we're fortunate to have Ange Postecoglou come in at one point, and he observed training and talked to us about, this is in the lead up to the World Cup, and he really challenged us around that, about the time and what we use for time, because he talked about the pressure of time for him in terms of a World Cup campaign and how little time they have together as a squad. And the fact that they have to make every second count. So they account for everything and they have to know exactly what they're doing and why. And that really resonated with me. And I think that's certainly true within, local footy as well, because we do have, and it's a huge mistake that often gets made in pre-season. I think you feel like it's a long period of time from the start of pre-season to the end. And so because of that, you often take liberties and you maybe aren't quite as specific as what you do. So I think having an understanding of what you want to train and why is really critical.
So leads me to my next question. If I were to throw you into a local coaching job again, say late November this year, and you had your pre-season to get your team ready, what would be some of the things you'd be thinking about in that first week when you get back to pre-season? What are some of the key things that you would be focused on?
Well, look, I think it's important to understand where you are and where you want to go. I think that helps to structure your program. But a couple of the core things, if we talk more broadly, that I would make sure were part of that were, I would try and do as much of the fitness in the footy as possible. And I think you can do that with lots of grid games and decision-making games where I think your players, and I think back to when I was playing, for me, I love doing that stuff. I would much rather do that and run around an oval. I'd much rather do a 7v5 ball movement drill where you're just in a grid and you're trying to move the ball up and back, for example. And I think the benefits in that are, players are educating about running patterns and how to get the ball and decisions they make with the footy. And, for me, that's maximum use of your time, trying to get that as part of what you do. The other thing I would do, which is probably different to when I was back there, I'd be better at using my resources. I think I tried to do too much as a senior coach in particular. And I think I'd utilise my resources to break down and have smaller group activities where, whether it be by position, whether it be by area, whether it be by skill set, whether it's trying to upskill some of your younger players or your lesser skilled players, or let your higher skilled players work together. I think doing smaller group stuff, I reckon there's enormous benefit in that. I think you allow the players to progress at their level. Allows you to be able to group and they can educate each other. And I think in terms of coaching, it's far easier. Lower numbers in the drill, more space. Typically, you're going to get an easier outcome in terms of coaching. It's far easier to see what happens in the drill. I'll give you an example. If you do a 2v1 ball drill where the aim is to get the ball from point A to point B, if it doesn't work, you'll be able to see exactly why. You know what went wrong. If you make those numbers 10v9 in a space, now you've got confusion. It's more game-like, but is really difficult to coach, because if you don't have the trained eye to be able to see and have an understanding of the game and what is happening, then it becomes really difficult. Maybe that fails. If you're looking to give your players feedback about why it failed, sometimes that becomes really difficult. So that doesn't mean you have to do 2v1 type situations. It means that allowing yourself to be able to understand what's happening is really critical. I remember when I first started at the Cats, and the Cats with their run and carrying ability to be able to use the ball by hand they were the best side was in 2009. I was kind of wanting Brendan McCartney to give me the answers, but he just kind of forced me to watch it and learn and review it and learn and review it. And it was the best thing he could have done for me, because whilst it was frustrating at the time, it taught me to see the game. And I think that's kind of almost what you're doing with your players. You're almost educating yourself as a coach at the same time. You're educating yourself what to see. You're educating yourself then what feedback to give players as well. So it doesn't mean you have to give feedback after every rep, but it does give you the power to be able to understand. And then from that, often you can form little breakdown drills that maybe can rectify some of the issues that might be popping up in your ball movement or whatever it might be. It doesn't really matter what drill it is. So they're two things. The other one that I've learned is, through my time in the AFL, is fundamentals are key. You have to be able to do the fundamental things well. That's kicking, marking handballs, but that's, picking up a ground ball under pressure. That's taking a contested mark. That's using your body to be able to own your opponent. All of those things, they allow you to be able to progress and become better in the game if you have those fundamentals. So again, being able to, if you use an example for pre-season, I would stagger my training. So I would have drills where they go, maybe it's that 8v6 type ball movement where they're going, and then you give them a chance to come down and they might do some breakdown craft drills. I think being able to stagger and tailor your training so it's not go from the start to the end, I think is a great way to be able to do it. Then you might go into a small group and then you go back into a big group drill where they're really working hard, and you can structure your training so it's not, everyone's not on the limit for the entire session. I think that becomes really important as well.
Fantastic. Now, I know a few of these questions could talk about for a long time, but if you could touch on coaches selecting leadership groups or a captain and a vice captain, what are some of the things you'd want coaches to think about in going about that process?
I think, and most clubs do, I think establishing your values become really important, whether it's, if you don't want to do it as a team, I think most teams do it where the playing group have a say in what their values are, what's important to you. If you don't do that as a playing group, I think even you have to be aware of what they are as a coach. We'll all have biases and we'll all have values that underpin who we are as people and who we are as coaches that dictate a little bit of how we go about our business. So I think you need to be really clear on exactly what they are. And that, again, if it's a playing group, I think the ability to be able to understand what they value is critical. And then your selection process boils down to who are the people that are living those the most. That's it. And I think often what can happen is we look to the best players. The best players sometimes aren't necessarily your best leaders, and they might not even be the most influential players within your group in a positive way. So you're trying to establish who the people who are going to influence the group in the right manner the most. Then, like I said, they're not always your best players, and it's really critical to be able to identify who they are. But I think based around those values and understanding what they are for your team, and each team's identity is slightly different. Often there'll be a relatively common thread that runs through most teams, I think, when it comes to values. But I think understanding what those things are for your group, and then now whether you empower your playing group to pick it or whether you pick it as a coach is kind of your prerogative. But I think having some kind of alignment to those values becomes critical. Otherwise, you will select the best players, just the best players. And by virtue of title, if they're not doing the right thing but they're deemed to be leaders, they will influence the group, but not in a positive way. So I think it's a big mistake that a lot of clubs make, and they make it with their recruiting as well, where I think they value performance over people, and in my experience that never works. if you have a short-term win because that player's unbelievable on the field for you, they will leave, and they will leave your club, and you're not necessarily in a better position than what you were in the first place. So for me, it's always people over player. That's my experience of seeing success, and a sustainable long-term culture is built around that. So that's, I think, what you do with your leadership group as well.
And what's your thoughts on if you're coaching a team and you got maybe one or two real star players, but they might not be the best trainers, or they're skipping a session, or late to this, late to that. How do you go about managing those type of players? Because they're the guys who sort of get you the wins on the weekend, but they're really not probably doing the hard yards. It's just because they've got a bit of that natural talent or that ability to really do well on field.
Yeah, for me, I think your job as coach is to try and educate them around why it's important. I don't know that those players always understand the influence they have on the group, and they feel like their actions are, because they don't impact on them and their ability to be able to perform on the weekend, they actually don't see it as a negative for the group at all. But the reality is your best players will influence all the time. The young players walk through the door and they see how they get ready for training. They see what they do before training. They see what they do after training. They notice when they're not there. So I think it's ability to be able to, as a coach, you're trying to educate them around the influence they have and why it's critical to the team. If it's impacting on your group, for me, they're the decisions you make in the interest of the greater good, and sometimes they're the more difficult ones. Sometimes guys can be unbelievable on the field, but the impact off the field far outweighs that. I don't think we put enough weight on that. I think the clubs that, particularly you're talking about community football, I think you have an unbelievable social obligation within your community to make sure you do the right thing. I think you are, you are leaders, you are influencers in terms of the young kids coming through, and you're obligated to make sure you do it in the right way. So if people are living or displaying habits that are contrary to that, I reckon you've got an obligation to your broader playing group, to your footy club, to your community, even more so, that is far greater than any individual. And I think we place too much emphasis on field, and we place too much emphasis on premierships. And I think footy clubs aren't necessarily just about that. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of our weight goes.
It's interesting. I had a business coach a few years ago, and he had this saying. He said, if you had a peanut butter sandwich, how much shit can you have in a peanut butter sandwich before the whole thing's no good? And it was always interesting. I always sort of thought whether that applies to sporting as well, but something I've always had in mind with that regarding how much sort of shit can you put up with before the whole thing's no good. So
yeah, I think there's, again, like, sometimes players need an opportunity to be able to be educated and try and change. And sometimes it's not for them. I've seen it, at a higher level where it's just not for certain players. They don't want to play at that level. The training and turning up twice a week is not for them. And that's okay. They can find another club somewhere else or in another league that is at a standard where that's allowable. But if that's not what your group stands for, and that's not what they want to do or how they want to conduct themselves, well, the decision becomes pretty easy. But unfortunately, I think we overlook that for talent, and it has an unbelievably detrimental effect, not only on your performance, but it does on your club. You start making those compromises, then you set yourself up to fail, in my opinion. And I'm sure some great players have had unbelievable influence on the field, but I don't know how well they've left the clubs when they haven't been there. So that's my opinion. I think the obligation is far greater than just that 2 hours on game day.
With your own coaching and own performance, do you have any specific routines or rituals you do in the morning to get yourself right for a game day or anything, or even just a training session?
The training sessions, I do all the planning with Carlton. So for me, it's I'm heavily involved in the process pre, and then also game day. Training day. Part of my process, I guess, is to make sure everybody knows what's happening, where they need to be. So that's kind of, I guess, in terms of the routine, that's what I do. I guess trying to ensure that Everybody knows how the session's going to run, and we try and have it set up to be able to run as efficiently as we can. And if there's anything specific around energy in the group or things like that, I try and make sure that the group's aware of that. In terms of game day, the period sort of from our captain's run, which is the day before the game, finish about 2 o'clock. That time into game day, I try and allow myself to be footy free. So for me, it's about trying to clear my mind, not be corrupted and consumed by other thoughts or other footy stuff. The one thing that has really changed for me on game day is I think I probably was there too much for the players. I wanted to do stuff, and I wanted to be there, and I wanted to talk to them, and I wanted to make, and I really didn't help, I don't think. So I try and be there if they need. I've got a few guys now who've got routines, in terms of how they prep. We do certain things with them, so I'm available for that. Outside of that, I just stay out of the way. That's probably the thing that's really shifted for me, because, like I said, it was for me. It was me talking to the player to make me feel better, but it actually wasn't that great for him necessarily. If they want me, they'll come and find me and they'll talk to me. So, I've had a significant shift, I think, in the way I've gone about our pre-game.
Yeah, perfect. Has any failure you've had, or apparent failure, set you up for success later on?
I think, well, I had, there's a couple of things that spring to mind. One is, as a player, I did my ACL twice. I was fortunate. I played a lot of games, and then I had, I was a bit unlucky with some injuries, and didn't play. It didn't end up playing much after that. And at the time, I loved footy, and I loved coaching and everything that was involved with local footy at the time when it happened. And it was pretty. I was distraught at the time when it happened. But for me, now the perspective that I have with injured players and long-term injured players, I have that because I've lived it. I understand the emotional side of it. I understand the roller coaster of going through your rehab and then coming back and re-injuring. So, at the time, that was one that I probably really struggled with. But in the long term, that's actually really helped me with some players in terms of having lived through that. The other thing I did probably when I first started at the Cats, I'd come from local footy. I think I felt like I needed to prove myself all the time. So, I often would try and have the answers, always have the answers. I think I've become much better at asking questions, being prepared to say I'm not sure, being really inquisitive and not necessarily feeling like I need to have all the answers all the time. I still get caught in that sometimes, but that's probably something I've really worked hard on. It was probably a little bit natural given that I was a local football coach, and I'm coming in and it's Matthew Scarlett and Jimmy Bartell and Gary Ablett. That was kind of intimidating from that point of view. But I became a much better listener, much more open to learning things and doing things a different way. So that's certainly something I've learned along the way.
In that transition period when you went to the Cats, I think it was 2009, you said it was your first year. Was there any things that really helped you adapt to going from local football to AFL football?
Probably the thing I did do was I think it's a good lesson for all coaches. I leveraged the things I was good at as much as I could. I'd run a local footy club where you're the recruiting manager, you're the player welfare, you're the property steward. I used to take the Bulls home and have to wipe them clean and sit them in front of the dryer so they were ready to go for Thursday night when it was. So I had a great understanding of the club from that point of view, and I also had a pretty strong ability to be able to build relationships, because that's what you do at a local level. You have to do that. So I felt like I had some technical shortcomings because I was coming from outside of that system. And so my job was to learn as quickly as I could. So I was coaching the VFL team. So I sat in every AFL meeting I possibly could, which was pretty much everything, which meant long hours and lots of time. And it meant, I'd be there till 9, 10 o'clock at night with the VFL, and then you'd be back there early the next day. But I wouldn't have traded that for anything, because that was my chance to upskill my technical knowledge. But I leveraged the things I was good at, and I think in coaching that's a great way to go. Work out who you are, work out what your strengths are, and be that coach. Don't be authentic to who you are, and I think that's a really critical thing. I think players and people see through when that's not the case. Just be authentic, leverage your strengths. It doesn't mean you can't work on some other areas of who you want to become as a coach, but that's certainly a great place to start.
Is there a player that you've come across that's really sort of exceeded their potential or really got the most out of themselves? And if there is there anything specific that they did that allowed them to do that, to get that much out of themselves?
Yeah, probably the one. There's one that stands out head and shoulders above everyone else, which is Mark Blitzarves, who's obviously at Geelong now. Mark come in having played some junior footy, maybe up to under 14 or something like that. And then, he chased his Olympic dream, in terms of trying to get to the Olympics running in steeplechase. And so he came in very raw. The things that stood out about Mark was he was desperate to be a good teammate, first and foremost. That's what he wanted to be. So that was his sort of foundation. He wanted to be a good teammate. He had a great appetite to work. So he wanted to become a better Mark, so he just grabbed Harry Taylor and he just worked with Harry Taylor after every training session. I kicked balls until I couldn't kick any more balls to them after training sessions, and he had that appetite to want to do that. So that was the doing. He applied himself. He was prepared to go above and beyond. He wanted to be a good teammate, and the other thing he did was he always asked questions. So if I showed him a piece of vision and I was trying to educate him about something, he would watch it, he would listen, he would absorb what I was saying, and then he'd be asking me another question about a different scenario. I understand that, but what if this happens? And then he'd want to know more. So he had a great mind in terms of being really inquisitive and wanting to know more. He wasn't just satisfied with knowing what I'd given him. He wanted to know the next scenario and what happens if this happens, and if this happens, what should I do then? And so that was the thing that stood out the most about him. He had a great ability to be able to ask questions, and not asking questions because he thought that's what I wanted to hear, asking questions because he genuinely wanted to know, which is a significant difference as well. So, there were a few of the qualities and a few of the things that really stood out with him, and probably there's a few others that have sort of made good jumps, and I think they're probably pretty aligned with him as well.
Yeah, no, I love that, Blitzarves. He's looking from afar. It is incredible, isn't it? Like to go from aiming for the steeplechase at London to 2012 to, I think he played round 1, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think so, against the Hawks maybe. Yeah.
Unbelievable, isn't it? Like, and in the career he's had, I was actually just funny. I was talking to a friend the other day, and he's going to be able to tell his kids that he won BNFs ahead of Danger, Ablett, Selwood. It's incredible career.
Look, he's a 2-time premiership player, and it's his attitude and appetite to want to be he wants to be the best player he can be, and I kind of, at the end of the day, that's all you can really ask of the players that come through, whether it be local level or, your appetite to be the best player you can be, and he certainly had that. I think his teammates really embraced him because of the whole element of that combined with wanting to be a good teammate. He just wanted to play wherever the team needed him to play, and he wasn't worried about. And even now, like he's a 2-time best and fairest at the club. Started and probably potentially All-Australian backman at the start of the year. Then they needed him in the ruck, and then he had to play on the wing, and he would have just done it because that's what the team needed. And I think that mentality has really endeared him to his teammates and made him, really loved within the footy club. He clearly had some attributes to run that came in, but he certainly embraced the footy mentality, which is really impressive given he'd come from an individual sport and then stepped into a team environment. He certainly embraced that side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a last couple of questions here for you. What are a couple of your favourite drills, and why are they?
I really like drills with a slight outnumber, whatever it be, and I think it's, we talked about it before. It might be a 6v4 or a 5v4, and you can just put them in grids either for handball or for kicking. But I think, and it might be slightly less, but I think you'll learn enormous lessons around decision making patterns, and the ability to be able to move the ball and why it works or why it doesn't work. And also conversely, particularly when you go maybe down by 1, you can't just play on an opponent once that happens. So defensively, I really like it because I think it gives you a chance to have to make decisions defensively where you might be deciding who the most dangerous player is or where the most dangerous space is, a couple of the most critical things in terms of teaching defence and learning defence. So I like those drills for that point of view, and there's a whole, like, how you want to set it up, how skinny the grid is, how long it is, how many numbers you have in there are kind of up to you. But I don't reckon as coaches you can kind of do enough of those drills, because you do get enormous education off the back of them. I think they're great, and players love doing them. It's virtually like playing a small game as well.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could give you a banner that you could place on every coach's bedroom door that they're going to see day in, day out, what would it say?
Um, I think perspective is key. I reckon we've got to remember footy's a game, and it's bloody hard. So it would be something along the lines of that. I think we have to try and make it fun. As coaches, we have to make it fun. It doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean we don't try our best. It doesn't mean we don't take things seriously. But footy's a game, and we should treat it accordingly. And we should, people's footy careers are not typically that long. Whether it be local footy or whether it be AFL footy, you should enjoy yourself when you're there. I think you're going to get the best out of yourself if you're prepared to do that. There's no doubt about that. If you're capable of being able to do that. The other thing for coaches, I think, is we've got to remember how hard the game is. I think we forget, and we're really fortunate at AFL level. We sit in an elevated view, probably the air conditioner on, looking down with no fatigue, and where we see the space, we see the decisions, we understand what is happening in the game. We have all the benefit of all of those things, and often we lose perspective around what we're expecting our players to do. Under fatigue, sometimes inexperienced. So we have to maintain some perspective around that, and it doesn't mean that we don't, again, drive high standards or have high expectations for our players or for our team. But I think understanding and being then able to probe and understand what players are seeing or what they're thinking is really critical. So we've got to take our coach's hat off and put our players' hat on sometimes to maintain a bit of that perspective. I think they're two things I think are really critical. It's the best game in the world, and we should help everyone to enjoy it. And that's kind of our job, I reckon, as coaches.
Yeah, it's actually interesting to your first point regarding, football doesn't last forever. It's interesting. I watched this week, Scott Pendrell obviously broke the Collingwood record and had a little video on him, and he mentioned when he first got to the club, there was him and he was one of 9 draftees and so forth, and he said Mick hit him sort of between the eyes a bit and said, after 4 years, history says only 3 of you are going to be here. And 4 years later, it was literally Scott, Dale Thomas, and I think Alan Tuvey were the 3 remaining players. And yeah, that's right. It doesn't last long, does it?
Oh, and particularly if you're talking about coaching juniors, it's even more critical. I've done some coaching forums where I've asked coaches, and I've got them to shut their eyes and try and imagine the things they remember from playing junior footy. And there's virtually not one person in the room will tell you anything about footy. They'll talk about catching up with their mates after, or the fact that their mum used to buy them a pie and Coke afterwards, or how wet the ground. It's a game, and it's a beautiful game, and it's a pure game. And particularly with juniors, we've got to help them to love the game. I think if we don't, we're doing them a disservice. And yes, there's discipline and training, but it's a great game. We've got to teach them to love the game, and some of them will struggle with that more than others, so it's even more important for them. So again, we shouldn't lose perspective around that, particularly with juniors. Often it ends up being about our ego as coaches and us wanting to be successful for us. The players will want to be, but at the end of the day, not many players I know, really recall premierships that they've won or how significant they were. It'll be all the other stuff that they remember, their mates, and like I said, the dewy mornings and the snakes at halftime, and it's that stuff. It's so simple, but we forget it often.
Fantastic.